Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Transfigured. I am very excited today to welcome back Father John Behr. Father John Behr is the professor of humanity at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. He has many other accolades, but I will pass over those for now and just wish you a warm welcome back to the channel, Father John. And today we are going to be talking about Gregory of Nyssa, and specifically Gregory of Nyssa's work on the human image of God. Father John Behr has made a new edition and translation of this work, and I'd highly recommend checking it out. I think it's a very mind-blowing work, really, in many ways. So the first question I want to ask you is, obviously you have limited time and attention to be focusing on translation efforts and critical edition efforts. What brought this work to your attention, and why did you think that this was a worthy project?
My goodness, it's such a fascinating work. And it grabbed me early on. I think even while doing my doctoral work back in the early 90s on Irenaeus and Clement, I was fascinated with this text. And in fact, one of my first written articles, published articles, was on this text. My reading of it's changed quite considerably since, but it's just grabbed my attention. With Irenaeus, and I've been fascinated by how they think about the human being. And here's a text devoted to that. And it's got lots of really intriguing, provocative, and fascinating things to say in it. But how it was holding together as a text as a whole, it took me 20 years to begin to figure that one out. So it's just grabbed my attention, and it's been in a kind of stream of the work I've been doing over the last couple of decades. And then the other part is, your readers might not know, but there's a standard set of critical editions of Gregory of Nyssa, critical edition of the Greek text, published by Leiden, by Brill in Leiden. And the only text they don't have, or one of the key texts they don't have in that series, is this one. And they've been promising it for decades. So as I kept on working on it, kept on teaching, going through it with students and learning more about it and beginning to figure out how it worked, I figure a new translation is really needed because there are real problems with the old one back from the 19th century. It's the only English translation. And if I'm going to do that, well, I may as well do a critical edition. Why not?
Yeah, sure.
Actually really work through the Greek text. But that also goes to the title of the work. So the title of the work, as people knew it in English, was On the Making of Man, which suggests something like, a commentary on Genesis and how the human being was made from earth in the image, and fairly simple like that. But actually the manuscript tradition, and in its Latin translation by John Scotus Eriugena, the title is On the Image, or on the image of God, or on the human image of God. So going through the manuscripts, helped me see more how the work is in all its details.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And, I learned some time ago when doing translations that you don't really get to know a work until you've done a translation of it. Mm-hmm. You can read it many, many times, but only when you translate it do you have to pay attention to how each word is used across the whole of the text. Yeah. And so that really forces a detailed attention. And when you do a critical edition, that's magnified tremendously, because you've got to pay attention to each Greek word in each Greek manuscript and possible variants for each word. So intimacy with the text.
Yeah. So can you tell us a little bit about who Gregory of Nyssa was, and what was the occasion for writing this work, as well as what are some of the influences and works and ideas that are going on in the background of his mind as he's writing this?
Yeah, so he's a figure from the late 4th century. His brother was Basil the Great. Usually in theological circles, they're known as the Cappadocians, Basil, Gregory, and their friend Gregory the Theologian, or Gregory of Nazianzus. And they were absolutely key figures in the development of theology in the East. And they all came out of the Origenian tradition. Yeah, so Basil and Gregory's family their grandmother had been converted by Gregory the Wonderworker, who was a student of Origen. So it's kind of, a long tradition of theology being passed down through the generations, modified in different ways, of course, with things like that. The occasion of the work, there's a letter prefacing the work, which is a letter to their brother Peter, who was another bishop, and Gregory's offering this work to him as a gift, a paschal gift, a gift for Easter. So that's probably 379, something like that.
Sure. So that's a little bit different than the Easter gifts I might give in my family. I'm not sure if I've ever written a theological treatise for my younger siblings as an Easter present.
There we go.
It says something about the family.
Yeah, they're highly literate, highly educated. And there's all sorts of word plays going on in the way that he presents it to his brother. Yeah. As for background, I mean, he's drawn upon a long tradition of reflection on the human being and the human being's place in the cosmos, and all sorts of anthropological, cosmological reflection, going back to the beginning of Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratics. Anaxagoras was one of the key figures in that. Then Plato, obviously Plato. In fact, Plato's work, the Timmaeus, which was also dedicated to the topic of the cosmos and the human being in it. We'll talk more about Plato in a minute, but then Philo, who took that kind of reflection and applied it to the books of Genesis, Origen, and in the introduction, I go through all of those figures and show how each of them saw that whole relationship between God, creation, and the human being. Absolutely fascinating.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit more about the connections with Plato's Timmaeus? And so like Plato's Timmaeus was, something almost like a textbook or a foundational text in the classical world.
Not just in the classical world, but all the way through the medieval period in the West. It was the most foundational work for thinking about cosmology and anthropology. Absolutely central. But when going through, doing the edition, translating it, and reading through all the background material again, and all the rest of it, it dawned on me that Gregory is actually reworking the Timmaeus in its literary form. And we know that Gregory could do that. He wrote a work called On the Soul and Resurrection, which is a dialogue with his sister Macrina as she's on her deathbed, about questions of death, resurrection, and so on. And he does it as a dialogue. He does it. It is absolutely an imitation, a modeling upon Plato's dialogue, the deathbed scene of Socrates, which is also talking about in the Phaedo, also talking about questions of death, immortality, and all those kind of things. So Gregory is able and capable of taking these classical forms and filling them with new content. And in some ways, it's so fascinating. It's really a unique period in the Christian period in Christian history when that could be done. You've come out of a period of persecution, Constantine, conversion, all of that kind of thing, but theological reflection hasn't yet settled upon the key themes that we might think of. Trinity, creation, Christology, salvation, whatever, all those key themes, and then people start writing about these particular themes. So rather, instead, what they're doing is they're giving expression to their Christian faith in all sorts of different forms. And in Gregory's case, he's taking absolutely foundational classical works for the whole of the ancient world and reworking them.
Right. And sort of, you could say, Christianizing them, and even maybe you could think of it as correcting them.
Correcting them in really intriguing ways, how they do that. So Timmaeus finishes his speech. Actually, it's in the Critias where he finishes it, where Timmaeus is praised for, how does he put it? For the God who formerly came to be, referring to the world, is now made evident in Timmaeus's speech. Gregory inverts that. So it is what was formerly in word now comes to be through Gregory's writing. So he shows us what God's creation is intended to be as a way of us getting to be that. He inverts the pattern then. So it turns it from being, if you like, protological to being eschatological.
Yeah. So I guess I'll leap right in with this question: is what is the image of God in humanity as Gregory is working on this? I mean, it seems like he's got a little bit of a conundrum that God is formless and beyond any specific appearance. It's not simply that our bodies have the same shape as God's body or something like that. And there he has a little bit of a sort of a gap between, you know, creation and sort of the, I guess you could say, the intellectual world. So he's sort of, I feel like, wrestling to get that tension right. What exactly
Well,
for him is our image? Or maybe you disagreed with some of my framing of that.
no, I'm going to have to take a step further back and go back to the Timmaeus just to explain what Gregory's doing, having taken the structure,
Sure.
not the content, but the structure from the Timmaeus. So Timmaeus's speech in the dialogue known as the Timmaeus by Plato consists of three parts. And it's really important to take note of these three parts. So the first part of Timmaeus' speech is describing how the world that came to be is the best of all possible worlds, made according to the most beautiful image in the mind of the demiurge, and all of that kind of thing. Yeah. But then Timmaeus stops himself and says, actually, I've only given half of the account, because the world that we live in is made of two forces, both the demiurge, the mind that's shaping everything, but also he calls it the straying cause, our tendency to go astray. Yeah, and so he says the mind has to persuade necessity, intellect has to persuade necessity, and that produces the world that we're in, where intellect is persuading necessity. And he goes through a whole second part of his speech where he talks about intellect, necessity, how intellect overcomes the irrational forces and all that kind of thing. But then he comes to the third part of his speech, which most people don't read because it's really kind of obscure, where he says, having given these two accounts, I've now got to put them together under a single head. Okay. And then he goes into all sorts of ancient physiology and anatomy and medical whatever, all this kind of stuff. So three parts: the intellectual model, the chaos that we see around us where reason is persuading necessity, but these two accounts then come under a single head, which is that of the human being. Okay, so three parts. So Gregory starts off his work by describing the human being as the perfection of creation. Yeah. He actually describes, he reads Genesis 1 as Moses describing the philosophy of the soul. Okay, now, for your listeners, we better just clarify what is meant by soul. Because when we talk about soul in modern language, I don't know, we tend to mean the inner me, the truth, whatever, that kind of thing. For Gregory, from the tradition before him, the word soul really means the animation within something. Yeah. So the best definition really for soul is the animation within the animated, or even better, the animation animating the animated.
Yeah.
And what you're doing there when you're speaking like that is you're really talking about classification. So, if you've got a rock, a plant, a cat, and a human being, rock is matter. There's no animation in it. A plant is also matter. It's got bodily form, it's got matter, but it's also got the power of growth and nutrition. Yeah, it's animated. So we talk about vegetative souls. Yeah. If you take a cat or a dog or any other kind of animal, it's got matter like a rock. It's got the power of growth and nutrition like a plant, but it's also got the power of sense perception and reaction and whatever else it might be. And then you've got a human being, which has got all of those powers of animation, but it's also got the capacity for free will, rational thought, and so on. Yeah. So the way Gregory reads Genesis 1 is in terms of, as he puts it, the evolution of the soul. The way in which nature, I'm quoting him, nature makes an ascent, rising upwards, an ascent from the lower forms of life to the higher. Because in Genesis 1, you've got the material reality, then you've got plants, then you've got animals, then you've got the human being. So the human being is the high point of creation. But he says it's not just a high point of creation, because we also share in intellect with God. what God gives us a share in intellect. So it's kind of beyond that. We're touching between the two, bring the two together. And he waxes lyrical about the beauty of the human being. He'll go through all sorts of things, saying, only the human being stands on 2 feet and looks upwards. All other animals stand on 4 feet or 2 feet and look downwards, and so on. So it's a dignity of our creation, even down to the very fact that we've got fingers. The very fact, he says, that we've got fingers enables our mouth to be formed for speaking words, rather than, I don't know, grazing grass or something like that. So the very bodily form is adapted for a rational animal.
Yeah. And he makes sort of a paradoxical point about humans in our sort of defenselessness is somehow suiting us for rule over everything else.
So it's really incredible what he does. He says we're called to rule, have dominion, but but we're the weakest of all creatures. We come out we're not even able to walk. Every other animal can walk and do whatever it needs to immediately. We can't do that. He compares us, to the lion, to the bear. We're defenseless in all of these things. So in our weakness, we're called to rule, and that modifies then how we're supposed to rule. We're supposed to rule through the cooperation of those who we rule. So it's not just power and dominion in that sense. It is by working together, soliciting cooperation, all for the good, and so on. All these kind of things.
No, that force of persuasion again, instead of the force of just sheer force or
brute materiality, brute force. It's also through the weakness of our body that we develop our rational faculties. He points out that if it weren't for the body and the material senses, especially speech, hearing, sight, and so on, our mind would be incommunicable and isolated and would never grow. So it's through the body that our intellectual faculties actually grow. Again, the combination of strength and weakness, the paradigm of which, of course, is Christ on the cross. My strength made perfect in weakness. So beautiful description of the human being like that. And then in chapter 12, I think it is, he then kind of, in a long discourse about laughter and all sorts of other things that goes on with that, he makes a brief comment which he doesn't really pick up or do anything with at that point, where he says something like, as long as our mind is oriented towards God, our mind is beautified and our bodies are beautified like a mirror in a mirror of a mirror. If, on the other hand, we turn our attention towards the body, well, the body as matter in itself is shapeless, and so our minds also become shapeless. So we can turn our attention either way. Our bodies can become beautified if our mind is directed towards God. If it turns the other way around, well, we become as shapeless as matter in itself is shapeless. Brief comment. So the first 15 chapters, beautiful description of the human being, but he gives no indication of whom he's speaking about. He hasn't mentioned Adam. He's not talking about Adam. He's just talking about the human being, culmination of creation. Then he starts off chapter 16 by saying, well, let's go back to our first text again. The text is that of Scripture. God said, let's make the human being in our image after our likeness. And he says, well, look around you. Where do you see that? What you see around you, it's not a question of the bodiliness or anything like that. What you see, it's more what you see around you are people who are falling sick and dying. So how can this pitiable, miserable, short-lived creature be said to be the image of God? Let alone all the vices and everything else, war and whatever, that we bring upon ourselves or enter into. How can you possibly say that the human being is the image of God? It's not an empirical statement. And yet Scripture's not lying. So how do you hold those two things together? And then begins the whole second account, which gets quite complex, really quite complex. So he says, for instance, well, let's go back to Scripture text again. It says, in the image of God, he created him, male and female created he them. Well, he points out male and female is not in the prototype, because in Christ Jesus is neither male nor female. So we already see a departure. Yeah. But what's the significance of that departure? If God's intention is to make males and if God's intention is to make a human being, why did he also make males and females? Especially when in Christ there's neither male nor female. Why make male? If you want to make a human being, well, make a human being. But he made males and females. Why?
Right.
Yeah. He then carries on, and then he points out that in fact, the difference between God and ourselves is that we came into being from nothing. The difference is not the male and female part. That's there, but it's not quite clarified yet. The difference is that we've come into being from nothing, and therefore movement and mutability, changeability is at the very core of our existence. Yeah?
Yeah.
We can go one way or the other. It's at the very core of our existence. And then he says, foreseeing the waywardness of our will, God devised for us this distinction between male and female, which no longer looks to the archetype, but is assimilated to the lower animals.
Mm-hmm.
But then he says, what I'm saying, I'm not saying what comes to my mind emphatically, positively. Rather, I'm giving you exercises for a well-disposed hearer. So he's making you work. He's playing with it. He's making you work to really think through all of this. Okay. Then in the next part of that, he then goes on to say that the human being that's made in the image of God is the totality of all human beings from beginning to end. Yeah. So they've got the idea, which might sound strange to us, that there is going to be a fixed number of human beings. We tend not to think like that. We tend, multiplying industry, population growth, whatever, all of that.
No, yeah.
I think that there's a fixed number that God's got in mind. Just strikes us as odd. But as he points out, God does nothing without form. And for there to be a form, but there must be a limited number. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And, if we take seriously, the world will pass away. Then whenever it passes away, that's the end.
When the last trumpet sounds, then
however that comes about, there will be an end, and therefore there will be a fixed number, even if we can't calculate it now. There will be a fixed number. And he says it's the totality of all human beings from beginning to end that together constitute the human being who is the image of he who is.
Mm-hmm.
Which
so
is
there's
mind-blowing.
Right. So there's a sense in which each individual is an image of God, but then there's a collective sense that's perhaps more true. Yeah.
Which is it's just straightforward Paul.
Mm-hmm.
The one Lord Jesus Christ. Yes, of course, he is the image of the invisible God, but he's also the head of the body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah? And the body is both singular, you are the body, and individually members of it. So together, the whole human race constitutes the body of Christ.
Right.
And
so in a certain sense, the creation of the human being isn't finished. It's very much a process.
Collectively. Yeah, we're still about, and then as he plays with the thing about male and female, and he does all sorts of detours around it, which have led people into thinking that before the fall, we would have been able to multiply like the angels, that kind of thing. Sexuality became operative after the. Gregory said nothing about the fall. He's not thinking in those terms. He's really not thinking in those terms. That there's a two-stage creation, all that kind of thing. No, Gregory plays with those kind of ideas, which were in the air. And then he then comes back to the Genesis text and points out that, in fact, it's only after the distinction between male and female that God blesses us to increase and multiply.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so there never was any other kind of way. He's been playing with his readers, but he's playing with his readers in such a way, as he says, exercises to make them think. Right. We typically think, or in the ancient world anyway, we typically think of marriage for the sake of procreation, for the sake of providing heirs to continue the family name, or to provide security for me in my old age, or that kind of, that kind of thing. And his point is, no, you shouldn't be thinking like that. Yeah, That's a very, very human way of thinking, a very selfish way of thinking for that matter. The real point then about male and female is not to be able to provide heirs and whatever like that. The point of male and female is that that is the way in which the human race multiplies to reach the fullness of the number that is the image of God.
Yeah.
And so there's a divine aspect to it.
Yeah. So, but he does talk about angels having perhaps some mysterious way of procreation that we are unaware of. But is he connecting the need for male genderedness and sexuality with you're saying it's not with sin, but it's more with our embodiedness and maybe our similarity to the other creatures that is.
As he starts off, the human being is both divine and creaturely. We're the midpoint between the two. We embrace both aspects, and both these aspects are there in everything that is human. And that undoubtedly includes male and female. He starts off, the great doctrine of Scripture is this: male and female in the image. The question is, how do you hold it together? But when he does those things about maybe we could have multiplied had there been no fall, had we stayed in paradise, we could have multiplied like the angels. He's playing with his readers.
And perhaps that was a position of his maybe opponents or other Christians somewhere else.
And there were people who thought like that, no doubt about it. But if you look carefully at what he says, it's his opponents who are actually advocating that position. So you've got to be really careful with how he reads it. There are 3 points at which he does it, in 16 and 18, I think it is, and in 21, 22. And when he finally does it, he comes back to the point, look, Scripture does not say increase and multiply until after the distinction between male and female. There are all sorts of other things he does in that. For instance, he starts off with the question of do the passions which arise in us, do they originate from the body? Which is what we tend to think. We fall into gluttony because I'm embodied, I've got to eat, fall into gluttony. And he points out, well, if you look at all the other creatures, they've got the same bodies as we do, but they don't fall into the same passions. So it is, as he puts it, the wicked husbandry of the mind that distorts the natural impulses into passions. And if you were to prick the bubble of the wicked husbandry of the mind, then every one of those impulses would contribute to the divine image.
So it's like if the passions are controlling the mind, then you get all of these vices that are
the mind is misusing the body. It's not if the passions are controlling the mind, it's the mind that's misusing the body.
But the same passions combined with the mind in the proper way yield virtues.
Totally. But the problem lies in the mind, not lies in the body. So the Christian discipline of fasting, for instance, which is practiced throughout the centuries, is not a discipline to control the body. It's using a bodily technique to control the delusion of the mind. I used to ask my students, who here would say something like, I cannot do anything in the morning till I've had a cup of coffee? And invariably half the students would put their hands up, and my response would be, well, you're a bunch of idolaters, because you can. Physically you can. It's a mental apprehension that you can't. So it's a mental delusion that you can't do anything. And so going without the coffee in the morning starts to break that delusion. The problem's in the mind, not in the body. Fasting is using a physical technique to correct a mental delusion, and then for all the other kind of things. And really, for the whole problem lies in the oxymoron that the human being is a rational animal. We're an animal, we're embodied, we've got drives like all the animals, but we're also rational. The word animal in Greek would be alloga. So it's really logikos allogos. The irrational, the rational irrational. And it really is a matter of the right ordering between the two. Which you could put up very summarily in the sense of, do we eat in order to live, or do we live in order to eat?
Mm-hmm.
So God has created us in such a way that we need to eat in order to live. And for whatever reason, he's created us in such a way that we have pleasure when we eat. If we eat something nice, we have pleasure in it, yeah? And there's absolutely nothing wrong in that. But the point of eating is to be able to do the things which are properly human. Do we eat in order to live as a human being? But I just think how much of our time is spent thinking about eating, or about how to prepare a dish so that it's even more tasty. Yeah, and so we in fact live in order to eat.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's the tension between those two things. Yeah,
right. Like I remember an example he gives is like fear. Fear can lead to cowardice, or fear can lead to like proper reverence of God. Like the same passion can be disordered towards a sinful vice, or properly ordered to its virtue. It's not the passions themselves that are wrong.
It's probably better to say the impulse rather than the passion. Yeah, passion typically has got a negative association.
Yeah,
it's the impulse which leads to either fear or reverence or whatever the occasion is. Yeah. So he goes through all of those kind of things from chapter 16 all the way through to chapter 29, including some really interesting stuff. He points out, for instance, that because we're always moving, we start off with that, or little chapter 16, that movement's at the very core of our existence. And because evil is necessarily finite, when we come to the end of that, because we're always moving, we will necessarily turn around and return to the good. Yeah, his passages on that around chapter 22 are some of the most universalist passages that you find in any Greek writer. But that's also part of the thing. When we come to the end of our evil way, because evil is necessarily finite, we will, because we keep moving, we will necessarily keep moving and have to return backwards. Yeah,
right.
But you can also think about it in terms of when we come to the end of our lives, we are dead. Whatever kind of ways we go through our life, we're going to end up at that point. And then because we necessarily keep moving, we enter into the resurrection. Yeah? And that's then combined with the idea that the human being in the image of God is a totality of all human beings from beginning to end.
I got the image from that. Like, imagine that there's a room that has one door that leads to infinity, but the other parts of the room are walls. And if you're wandering around in straight lines blindfolded until you hit something and you change direction, eventually you'll go out the door. Right. And so as long as you keep moving, because good is infinite and evil is finite or limited or has some sort of barrier at the end of it, as long as you keep moving, it's like a ping pong ball or a pinball, you'll eventually get pointed in the direction of the good and the infinite and keep moving in that direction.
You might want to kind of adapt that image slightly to say that the room is a circular room.
Yeah.
You kind of go in and you kind of continue all the way around, you follow all the way around. There's no other way apart from to exit.
And so when does he imagine this sort of infinite time for improvement happening, I guess?
Well, we haven't finished the text yet.
Sure. Go ahead.
But with regard to that, and the reaching the pleroma, the fullness of the totality of human beings, that's when time will come to an end. So he actually says time, the extension of time. How do you put it? The extension of time is for the growth of the human being. So the growth of the whole of humanity into the image of God. The time of this world, it will come to an end. Time is coextensive with the production of the human being. Okay. But then in end of 29:30, he then turns around and starts again. And he goes back to his first text. And so it's a third part. And now he does what Timmaeus does in the third part of his work. And for the last chapter, which is a really long chapter, he goes through all sorts of medical and anatomical descriptions. When you read them, you can think, what on earth are you talking about? Why are you telling me about how the spleen's connected to the liver and whatever, all of that? On the one hand, I guess perhaps he's showing off a little bit his knowledge of Greek medical literature, and Plato and all the rest of it. But what he does is then to say, in fact, what we've just traced, the evolution of nature from the lower forms of life to the higher, and the time being the extension of time being needed for the production of the human being, is in fact what happens in each of our lives. So each of us, no doubt about it, we've come into existence involuntarily by a seed being deposited in the womb. Just no doubt about it. Whatever they might have thought about how the seed forms, whatever, but it's concrete, it's real. And then in the womb, it grows. And it grows through the power of growth and nutrition, like a vegetable, on that level. When the fetus, the infant, is big enough, strong enough, well-formed enough to come out of the womb into the world of sense perception, where it then continues to grow. And then he finishes the work by urging us to put off the old man and put on the new man. And he likens the whole thing to, he says, nature, the all-contriving, sculpts within herself from living matter, sculpting the sculpture of the human being, growing in the womb, coming out, growing in its world, and so on. In my introduction, because Gregory finishes his work at that point with exhortation, put off the old man, put on the new man. In the introduction, I look at one other work of his, which is a homily of his, consoling those who've had people falling asleep, consoling the bereaved. And then he points out that in this world, in fact, we are fetuses and not yet human. We're still growing to become human being as Christ has shown it to be, which ultimately comes about through our death and resurrection. So he says, death is training us in this world. We're never the same daily. Our bodies take things in, put things out, we grow. Our bodies change all the time. And we're growing in this world. Our faculty of sense perception is activated when we come out of this womb, but it's still unformed. The newborn has got to learn. It's got to learn to walk. It's got to learn to talk. It's got to learn to think. It's got to learn to do all of these kind of things, all of which will ultimately end up with death. However we grow in this world, we end up with death, which is now our birth from this maternal womb of the world. It's Romans 8. The whole world is groaning in travail. Until the revelation of the sons of God, which comes about through death and resurrection in Christ. And so he's divided the work into three parts: the beautiful image of the human being, the work in process on a cosmological scale, and then what's happening individually. And I actually am ever more inclined to think that the real focus for all these writers is what's happening individually. Two other pieces, the ideal picture of the human being, and then thinking about the whole of cosmology and the time of the world, the growth of the human race, and that kind of thing, gives us a way of understanding ourselves now. Having come into existence, growing in a life which is going to end in death, but a death which is now a birth in Christ to be part of his body in the resurrection.
The lessons of the macrocosm help us understand our role as a microcosm of that. Like a fractal version of the same pattern.
It's exactly that. So you've got gosh, at least 3, if not 4 different arcs which are going on. You've got the arc from Adam to Christ, from type to reality, from the one who's written about to the one who actually comes to be, all the different ways you can put that out. You've got the arc, which is the movement of creation as a whole, which is the evolution of different stages of life, which he's happy to see in Genesis. Now, obviously, he's not talking about Darwinian survival of the fittest or anything like that, but any geologist will tell you that life came to be about in certain stages. You've got plants and you've got animals, and obviously.
There are multiple times when I was reading this book, I'm like, you're right. It's not exact. I'm not claiming that he anticipated Darwin's theory of evolution, but there are some times where it's so similar, it's
Yeah,
almost eerie.
it
Like
really
this
is.
quote from chapter 8. For this reason, the human being was fashioned last after the plants and animals, nature advancing in a certain way sequentially to perfection. It's like there's a lot of biologists that would be like, yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah.
And this idea, like even in biology, there's an idea that if you look at this development of a
Oh,
fetus,
I want to come back to that. I want to come back to
go
that.
for it.
But
Go
I
for it.
just said, you got the scriptural arc from Adam to Christ. You got the evolution of nature from lower forms of life to higher, just what it is.
Mm-hmm.
In an evolution which will come to an end and the world will end, however that happens. You've got the evolution of the human race, yeah, to reach its totality. But then you've also got the evolution of each human being, from a seed, a fetus, a toddler, to maturity, yeah? And all of these steps are paralleling each other or recapitulating each other.
Yeah.
So, there are various social anthropologists, evolutionary anthropologists, who point out that the stages of the human race are parallel by the stage of the human being.
Yes.
You know, at some point we were prelingual, no doubt about it. And at some point we gradually acquired language. At some point we gradually acquired means of writing and utilization and tools. Well, look at the growth of any child. Of course it does that.
Yes. Yeah. There's even a stage where a human fetus has something like gills and a tail, right?
Yeah.
And you can see the history of all of the course of human evolution, or all of animal development through the different stages of fetal development. And they'll even use the word recapitulation. I've heard biologists use the exact same word from Irenaeus or something.
Yeah. So it's just mind-blowing that for me, it's just mind-blowing that he's done all of that in this work.
Yeah.
And he's done it as an expression of Christian theology, reusing classical forms. I mean, how brilliant is that?
Yes. So I guess a question is so what is the human for now? And to add a second question to it, also a big question is what is sin, and how can humans go astray? And how does, like, you're right that he doesn't really talk about fall, but he does talk about maybe the strain. He applies Plato's strain cause to humanity.
Let's just keep very real for a minute. Yeah. So the word sin, its primary meaning is missing the mark.
Yeah.
Rather than think of it in terms of misdeeds, guilt, and legislation, its primary meaning is missing the mark. Well, a newborn baby misses the mark of being fully human. Yeah. I get challenged so many times when talking like this. Is a newborn baby not yet human? Is a newborn? It totally depends what you mean. Yeah. A newborn baby could be born perfectly healthy and all the rest of it, but can it walk?
No, like as I told you before the microphone was on, I've got a 5-week-old upstairs.
To paraphrase Christ's words in John 9, was it because a baby sinned or his parents? Well, not Christ's words, Christ's answer to the question. Yeah. Well, obviously now, is a baby's inability to walk due to a fall in some primordial time which corrupted human nature thereafter? No, I mean, that's just silly. Yeah, the baby can't yet walk, not because of any imperfection, assuming it's born healthy or whatever, but because it's got to grow. Yeah, so it's missed the mark, but that's not. It's fallen from what it's called to be, but it's not in the way we typically think about it. It's got to grow, and part of the newborn baby learning to walk is going to be falling down and getting up. Of course it is, yeah. And if a parent tries to stop a child from falling down and getting up, the child will never learn to walk. Very simply, yeah. Now, of course, the infant will get bruised, and that'll be painful, and it'll be just as painful in its own way for the parent who's standing by watching, but the parent has to bear with the child as the child falls down and gets up again, yeah. And then likewise through the whole course of life as we learn to put on Christ. Yeah. So if you like, it's a fall from the future. It's a fall from what we're called to be, not a fall from a past. It's sin in the sense of not yet being what one's called to be, missing the mark. But that missing the mark is not the guilt of the baby or the parents. It's just the natural evolution of how these things work. Yeah. Now, as the newborn baby becomes a toddler, running around, walking, and then grows older and starts to beat up its siblings, and starts hitting each other or whatever, you've got to start introducing discipline. Yeah, in a way you wouldn't do for a 1 month old.
Right.
You just wouldn't, yeah. And so you start, and again, it's like, as Paul puts it in Romans, sin wasn't accounted before the law. Yeah, of course, death reigned and sin reigned from Adam to Moses, from Moses back to, and of whom he's a type of the one to come. But sin wasn't accounted. Where there's no law, there's no sin. In that sense, yeah. So now when the toddler reaches whatever age is appropriate, you start to introduce rules and regulations and a bit of discipline and threats and whatever is appropriate, and then hopefully the child grows in virtue through all of that and learns to behave and control itself and act in a more loving way and this, that, and the other. When the child reaches teenage years, you've got to have a different kind of discipline. It's going to no good trying to deal with a teenager, a prodigal son, in the same way that you deal with a toddler. Yeah. So the whole of the growth is a pedagogy, yeah, which leads us to the end to which we're moving. Yeah,
gotcha.
where we learn by experience.
You brought up a quote earlier that was like, if it's sort of, I won't remember the exact words, but it's sort of like the idea that if we use our nous, our intellect, and we're looking upwards, sort of putting our minds on things of heaven as opposed to things of earth, then it's like our body is an instrument of sort of bringing the forms of heaven into material reality. But if we're looking down, right, if we invert, our intellect downward, then our intellect is absorbing like the formlessness of this world, and the process like happens in reverse in a bad way.
But it requires growth and education, pedagogy. So a newborn infant coming out in the world opens its eyes. I speak a bit metaphorically because it's really, however long it takes for the infant to actually see things is a different kind of question. But open its eyes, and you're caught by the beauty of the world. Yeah. But then you have to learn that not everything that seems good is good. And you have to learn to worship the creator rather than the creature. Yeah. But initially, of course, you're going to be struck by the beauty of the world, because you won't develop your mental faculties without opening your eyes and hearing words and whatever. Yeah. But again, it's part of growth which requires experience of both good and evil. Absolutely requires experience of both good and evil.
Yeah.
And so for Gregory, as he puts in chapter 22, I think it is, discernment is a higher state than mere knowledge. Yeah. There's some things you can only learn through experience. That's actually more Irenaeus now. Sweetness. Yeah, you can only learn that by experience, sweetness and bitterness, by tasting honey or by tasting whatever. Yeah? You have to learn by experience. Well, the thing we fundamentally have to learn is that we don't have life from ourselves. Yeah, and we can speak about that till we're blue in the face, but we all are going to live as if we do have life from ourselves because we're living. Even if I live in such a way that I don't have that manifests I don't have life for myself, it's still me who's doing it. So the experience of death becomes pedagogic. Yeah, that's when we finally learn that we don't have life from ourselves, and that's when we're now able to receive it fully. So death now becomes birth into life and all the other kind of things one can say.
Sure. Gregory talks about the knowledge of good and evil, and he's trying to figure out what the knowledge of good and evil was. And he talks about how evil often has to use some amount of goodness as almost like bait right?
Yeah.
To hide itself. And so how does Gregory understand what the tree of knowledge and good and evil is?
So he's playing on the words in. There are two things that are going on. He's playing on the words in Genesis because it says the fruit seemed good to the woman.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So visibly it appears good, but what's actually contained within it brings about death and destruction. But again, through death and destruction, as we were just talking about, we finally learn. Yeah. And so the conclusion of that whole narrative in Genesis is God saying, behold, man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's part of his answer in all of that. The second part would be, are there two trees or one tree?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you've got the tree of life, and you've got the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and both are planted in the center. Well, his question would be, how can there be two trees in the center? Yeah. So how then do you hold together the tree of the knowledge of good and evil and the tree of life? Well, the way he would do it, and combining with other things, of course, is the tree is a symbol of the cross,
Mm-hmm.
which is the tree of life, but it's a life which comes through death, hence the knowledge of good and evil.
Okay. that makes sense.
Kind of.
Kind of, yeah. So I guess maybe starting to wrap things up.
Mhm.
What are all right. So I actually have another question that I was wanting to ask. I've also been reading David Bentley Hart's book. Oh, I'm forgetting. Like Everything is Full of Gods, I believe, is his new
I haven't
book.
got to that one yet.
All right, but it's dealing a lot with the question of mind and body.
Yeah.
And what is the connection between mind and body? Are we just a material process? And he's sort of wrestling with kind of materialistic explanations of things and scientism. And is there really something in us that is more than just that? And sort of the mind body problem or the truth mind body problem and that sort of thing. And I noticed that Gregory is often doing something very similar to that. Like reading these two books at the same time, I'm like, man, there's a lot of questions that haven't changed very much in 1,600 years.
I think
And
Gregory is one of David's favorite writers, isn't it?
I would bet so.
Yeah.
So I guess how exactly does Gregory connect our minds with our bodies? What is the connection there?
I would go back to the thing we were talking about earlier. We use the language of soul at that point, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
where we said the soul is the animation animating the animated. Yeah, I corrected myself earlier because initially I said the soul is the animation within the animated, and I think it's not the best way of putting it because it sounds like you can take it out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you got animation inside the body, and you can take it out and it can survive. No, it's the animation animating the body. In the case of a human being, the highest dimension of that is nous, intellect. Yeah, and that is bound up in a pattern of thought that goes all the way back to Anaxagoras. And I think what Anaxagoras is doing is this again the macrocosmic microcosmic type thing. Yeah, he's looking at how do we take in meat, corn, whatever it might be, and then it becomes fingernails and hair and all the different parts of our body. Yeah, so he talks about it as we take these in, and our mind, nous, he uses the word nous, spins it. His word is perichoresis, which is fascinating. He's using the perichoresis, spins out the elements into the way in which they're needed for the different parts of the body. And then his conclusion from that is that God, whatever he thought of God, is the nous within the whole cosmos. Yeah. So God is a cosmic nous spinning out the cosmos in a particular way. So again, the analogy. And he's also very keen to say, and I think Gregory picks it up from him, that our nous is not something distinct from God's nous, from the nous that is God. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because Gregory corrects himself. He says God gave us nous, or rather did not give, but rather gave a share in nous. So there's some parallel going on with that. Okay. And then I'd also want to, Gregory at the end of chapter 15, he talks about, God being boundless and outside of all these kind of things, yet within. Okay, and I think he's talking Christology. Yeah, the immaterial word of God is yet within the body, and that kind of thing. But the end point of all of this is God finally becoming all in all. As we grow, as our intellects grow, from the initial fetal stage to a toddler stage and continue through death and resurrection, as our intellects grow, thereby transforming also our body in that respect, God becomes all in all, individually and collectively. So the whole cosmos becomes the body of God.
Yeah, but it seems that we're not just passive in that process either. We're given a role as actors and
totally. Yeah. No, absolutely. Yeah. I finished a set of lectures which are going to be coming out as a book called In Accordance with the Scriptures, The Shape of Christian Theology. And the section I did on Maximus, in that I did Irenaeus and Gregory and Maximus about the human being and the growth of the human being, so on. Maximus does something really interesting. He's answering the question of how can the end of the age have come upon us, as Paul says, and yet, as Paul also says, the blessings that are held in store for the future ages. Okay.
Yeah.
So with regard to Maximus, in one of his questions from Thalassius asks him, how can Paul say on the one hand the end of the ages has come upon us, and on the other hand he refers to the blessings in the ages to come? Which is it? Right? And Maximus does something really interesting. He says we must divide the ages conceptually. So the ages are not the age of the Old Testament, then you've got the Incarnation, then you've got the age of the New Testament. You've got to divide them conceptually, and we're to divide them between the age of passivity and the age of activity. So the age of activity, then the age of passivity. Okay? The age of activity is the age in which God becomes human. The age of passivity is the age in which the human becomes God. And they're paradigms of one another. So he says, God becomes human in those who are virtuous. So going to your question about activity, agents, active agency, and all the rest of it. Well, as we, in this age, until we die, we are active. And our activity is to grow in virtue, which humanizes God. Yeah. When we finally die, we are now passive, and thereby we can undergo, he says, the passive transformation of deification. We can be deified. We can't deify ourselves, but we can be deified, and that requires passivity. So the age of activity, the age of passivity. On the one hand, it's divided by our life and death. Are we still on?
Yes, we're still fine. Yeah.
Okay. On one hand, it's divided by life and death. I am going to be active until I'm laid in the grave.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, the activity I've got to learn to acquire virtue is also the activity of taking up the cross and dying to myself.
Right.
So it's not, one.
The your will, not my will, but your will.
Right. Or to be actively passive. Yeah. So it's not simply two sequential ages, but they're overlapping conceptually.
And sort of maybe wrestling or with intention with each other until they come into reconciliation or something like that. Yeah. So another question that was on my mind is when I'm reading this book, I see kind of a glorious combination of science, or well, science isn't quite, maybe that's a slightly anachronistic word, but not too anachronistic. He's talking about physiology. He's talking about zoology and different kinds of animals and stuff like that. He's talking about a lot of subjects that we would recognize and call science.
Yeah.
And he's talking about anthropology. What is a human being? Cosmology, the whole big picture, and fitting these things all together. And like you've drawn out really beautifully, these things all running in parallel and interconnecting each other. But I feel like in our age, like Christian theology really struggles to unite these different disciplines or different areas of knowledge into a coherent, cosmic and microcosmic picture. how much can we learn from Gregory to do that again? Because there are some parts of this, it's like, well, we don't really talk about humors of the body anymore, and his anatomy of the spleen isn't quite right, and like, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's some things that we know that don't work, but even at a deeper level, I think we struggle unifying different areas of knowledge and uniting them in a theological framework now.
Yeah.
What can we learn from Gregory to do that? How much can we take Gregory's own work to help us do it, or how much of a gap is there between our time and his that makes that difficult?
Oh, I think we need the boldness that Gregory had. Yeah, I just mentioned that I finished a new book, should be coming out soon, in accordance with the scripture. In the postscript to that, I end up by quoting a passage from Irenaeus, where he says, the whole of the economy is aimed at bringing us to the knowledge of things as they really are, the truth about God and the truth about the human being. And my conclusion from that is, it's either realistic and true, or it's neither.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's either, if it's true, it's real. And if it's real, we should be able to do it from the science as well.
Yeah.
So, yes, taking the 4 humors of the body and his description of the spleen, we're beyond that. Modeling ourselves on classical texts like the Timmaeus, we're beyond that. But that's where he was, and that was the best of his day. We should be bold enough to do that as well.
Yeah.
So to write a Christian theology which is not done in the form of, here's a doctrine of the Trinity, here's a doctrine of creation, here's a doctrine of whatever, but to actually give expression to the Christian faith in the forms presented to us, drawing upon quantum physics or whatever it might be, or archaeological evolutionary science or whatever else it might be. Using the best of the knowledge as we can do it. It's either true and real, or it's neither.
Yeah, it seems like Gregory was coming of age right at the time that sort of classical paganism was on its way out and Christianity was in ascendancy. And kind of right at that magical sweet spot that you sort of mentioned, where a good well-educated son of Christians in Cappadocia learns the Timmaeus and all of these different things, but then graduates beyond that to do Christian theology, but sort of takes the good and leaves the bad. I feel like we're almost in like a reverse situation. Sometimes it feels like where Christianity seems the decadent, maybe, and
we do not have the boldness to think through all of this again, and we cling on to forms of expression from other eras. Which is why I think this work by Gregory is so fascinating, because it's not done in the form that we've come to think theology must inhabit. And that's why we can learn from someone like Gregory, not to repeat him. Admittedly, that's what I've been doing for the last hour. Never mind. But on being inspired by the way he did, and to do it in our time.
Not stopping at simple repetition, using the repetition as inspiration and as coaching, but in a goal towards bringing it into being now. All right. Well, any other closing thoughts that you had, Father John?
No, I think we've done quite a bit over the last hour or so. We've done it pretty comprehensively and all sorts of different aspects from it. And I've also managed to get in a mention of a forthcoming book. But
well, great. I was unaware of that forthcoming book. I look forward to that. And I would say, while it was somewhat comprehensive, it was nowhere near comprehensive enough to prevent anyone from needing to read Gregory themselves. Hopefully we've just pieced things. I mean, I have a lot of quotes and a lot of notes that are left unaddressed. So there are plenty of things that are still left in greater detail than what we were able to cover today. So I would really highly recommend people read this book. And I think you were absolutely right to sort of pluck this book out as something worthy of really deep attention.
Thank you.
All right. So thank you.
Next time.
Until next time. And maybe we'll talk about your forthcoming book next time.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much, Father John Behr.